right, looks like we can get started. Hello and welcome everyone to the Global University Climate Forum. My name is Ashley Jankowski. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am a fellow at the Yale Office of Sustainability. I am thrilled to welcome students from around the world to our next session, The Psychology of Change Management. Before we begin, I'd like to read our statement of respect and inclusion. The Global University Climate Forum brings students together to share ideas, learn, connect, and act on the global imperative of addressing climate change. These are the forum principles of respect and inclusion. First, be inclusive. Strive to ensure that all feel welcome and valued. This applies to our speakers and guests, as well as our student participants. Be open. Consider ideas that challenge your beliefs. If we support and learn from one another in this diverse group, we each become stronger. Listen honestly. The forum is a neutral and safe space for testing ideas and asking questions. Work to receive rather than react. And finally, act mindfully. Bring the values of respect, inclusiveness, and humbleness into your actions as a climate activist. In the spirit of respect, inclusiveness, and humbleness, the organizers of the Global University Climate Forum acknowledge that in many cases, today's society is built on a foundation of oppression. Whether it has been through forced occupancy of land or through the subjugation of people, there currently exists deep and seemingly incurable injustices throughout the world. The organizers of this forum ask that all participants consider their role in advancing a new future and putting us on a pathway to right these wrongs. I'd now like to introduce our brilliant speaker, Dallas Scott. Dallas is the founder and principal of Trust, a change motivator and incubator for mission-driven institutions. Prior to this role, Dallas was the VP of Change Management at Greener U. She is a former Peace Corps member and holds a master's degree in urban and environmental policy and planning and environmental education and communication from Tufts University. Dallas is also a Global University Climate Forum organizer, so if you're enjoying this session so far, you can certainly thank Dallas for her help in making it happen. We're so excited to have you here today, Dallas. So Dallas will share her amazing presentation, and then we'll break into a Q&A. As you're listening, feel free to pop your questions into that Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And if you see a question that you really like and want to hear the answer to, you can upvote it, and I will prioritize it in our conversation. And with that, Dallas, you now have the floor.
All right, thank you. I am so excited to be able to present today. There's been such an amazing set of speakers. I feel honored to be one of them. Again, I am the founder and principal of Trust. It's an organization that I started in June, so newly minted. And one of the reasons why I started Trust and where the name comes from has to do with the work that I've done at organizations that are striving, and in my history I've worked with mostly college and universities. They're striving to reach these really ambitious carbon neutrality goals. And they've brought me in to support strategic planning and other key pieces in relationship to energy efficiency work. And one of the things that I identified in a lot of the work is even with the best plan and the strategies that you lay out in front of you, there's a lack of trust. There is usually a big barrier to actually implementing the plans ahead of you. And I think this quote by Stephen Covey puts it well, that change moves at the speed of trust. It's the center of our work, and it's how we get the collaboration needed to meet these times that we live in. The goals for today's session is to reflect on the importance of personal growth and our relationships to support organizational change. I'm going to do a mini overview of the theory behind group dynamics and facilitation. And I'm going to do a little bit of tools, some meeting mechanic fundamentals, just so you can walk away with something for your toolkit in your day-to-day as a change agent on your campus. I've had the opportunity, as Ashley said, since I've been a part of supporting this forum, to sit in on all of the sessions today or this week. And one of the things that we've covered have been just amazing conversations with incredibly smart people at very large scales. So I'm thinking about the global greenhouse gas emissions and the warming scenarios and kind of seeing the trajectory that we're heading and what it's going to take to actually curve so we can live in a sustainable world and habitable world. There's also the global climate conferences that we learned about and how national leaders come together to have these really important discussions. We've learned a lot about the Paris Agreement and what that meant. for climate action. And then we had great speakers about climate activism, to be able to stand up in the unique ways that different organizations have set the tone and the narrative of what's taking place. I specifically like the systems change, not climate change sticker that you see here, because there is so much that needs to be done, and it is so a part of being the humans and the organizations we're all a part of. And also, I have felt incredibly overwhelmed in a lot of ways. It's like, whoa, this is big stuff. Now what? And is anyone else feeling that way, where you're like super motivated, super inspired, and also kind of want to crawl up in a ball because it's incredibly overwhelming and daunting thinking about everything that's happening? I'm assuming we are relating in that way a bit. So there's a couple things that I do, and I found myself doing. I either zoom way out, like way out, like outer space out. And I like take a moment and I breathe and I remind myself that Earth is potentially a speck somewhere in this galaxy. And that if I think about humans on a geological timescale, we are just a tiny blip. And it kind of gives me a weird peace. But also I realize that actually doesn't solve anything, if nothing more than sort of a little bit of mindfulness act of perspective. So then the next thing I do is I zoom in, like super duper in, not like microscopic in, but I do zoom in to the point of thinking about the fact that we are fundamentally dealing with people, right? This is a people problem. We don't have environmental challenges, we have human behavioral challenges. That's what we're looking at here. And as someone with a psychology and behavioral background, this is where I get interested and go, I can do something with that. So think about people, as we have this little person here saying hi, with thoughts. So we have people with thoughts and insecurities, right? And behaviors. And sometimes like we're not even sure why we do what we do, right? But we have people with thoughts and behaviors. And the recognition of people's thoughts and behaviors has really come into clarity with me after having a couple of kids, because I have little tiny people with their thoughts and behaviors that I get to like observe often and be like, oh, we are all just like that, but bigger. And we make decisions that impact things in a different way, but we are still just these little people walking around with our thoughts and behaviors. And what we're doing with our thoughts and our behaviors is we're working with other people with their thoughts and their behaviors, right? So we're just people with thoughts and behaviors working with other people with their thoughts and behaviors. There's actually a technical term for this. Let's see if anyone in the chat can guess what this technical term is. I'll give you a moment. Meetings. I bet you didn't think I was going there. Meetings. Yeah, like we are in meetings all the time. This is what we do, with student projects, with putting this forum together. There's meetings, lots of different meetings that take place, different thoughts, different behaviors, different people coming together, trying to make decisions. But it's not just any meetings that we're trying to do in the context of trying to solve for climate change. We are working to have meetings with diverse stakeholders, with tapping into different thoughts, different perspectives, different histories, different people that don't look like us, have a history that's different than us, because we can't solve for complex problems like climate change with only the voices of a few. We have to go beyond our choir. We have to bridge that gap between the people we're comfortable with and other people in other industries with other areas of expertise who may or may not agree with us. And you're thinking, yes, this is so important. I'm there. I get it. JEDI work, diversity, equity, inclusion work, that's fantastic. But I'm also talking about the people who aren't on the same page right now in regards to climate action as well. Like those people need to be a part of the equation as well. And that's where your like thought bubble is like, oh, well, that actually makes me a little uncomfortable, which makes sense. And I'm going to talk about why that makes sense now. We are afraid of social risks. And when we branch out of our comfort zone and the people, like I'm feeling very uplifted by all the people I've heard talk today. I was like, that's right. We get it. Look at us. But then I remember, especially living in the United States right now, where I like looked at a huge amount of the electorate vote that went towards Trump. And I was like, ooh, I don't understand that, right? And I find my brain like firing the social risk piece and imagining if they were in my meetings and how I would react. And their social risk piece is real. And I just wanted to point that out at you, this fear of interacting with people, or this fear of having uncertainty in meetings, or lacking trust in your meetings, can register at the same part of your brain as physical pain. So I want to point this out so you acknowledge it and realize that this is a really real feeling, and this could inhibit my work because I am uncertain of how to interact with different people. So again, if we feel uncertain or missing trust, we can get consumed by it. So you can get consumed by it in when you're working with your own team, if it's a little dysfunctional and you're not going to be able to do the amazing work that you want to do. But it can definitely derail groups of people who may not see eye to eye even from the beginning. The other thing I want to be aware of is one of the reasons why we have this like social risk fear is because we can't read people's minds. So we look at their behavior and often try to just pin their intentions to their behavior. So we tend to judge ourselves, excuse me, we tend to judge others by their behavior and ourselves by our intentions, because we can read our thoughts. Like we know what our intentions are, but we can't do that with others. And so it's really important in the work that you do. We're talking, I heard Paul Clement Hunt talk about we need radical collaborators. And in the drawdown report, they talk about the need for accelerators. Like, how do you be that conduit? How do you be that person that branches and connects the technical experts, the social experts, the diversity experts, the people who are not on board yet, the economic experts? Like, how can you be that conduit? Because your behavior as a meeting facilitator, your behavior in the role here can determine the destiny of the group. So being so cognizant that you can actually be a big part of creating change just by looking inward and understanding what's going on in your mind and how you interact with people that you're trying to lead through this process. I'm going to go through some key terms because I find it helpful when thinking about why it can be challenging to work with people in our meetings and this like psychology group dynamics. The first one is social arousal. So social arousal is when other people are present, right? Something happens with our amygdala, sort of our lizard brain and our heart to kind of assess the situation. Like we're assessing for social risk, we're assessing for belonging cues, we're wondering how we're going to feel in this situation. And what happens is this little bit of arousal is going to strengthen our dominant response. So a great analogy here can be in athletics, right? So football or soccer, right? If you practice a whole lot, then there's a good chance when lots of people are watching, it's going to enhance that practice behavior. You've practiced that specific kick at that specific time with people on the field over and over and over again, and you know you can do it. But if you haven't, there's a good chance that it impairs difficult behaviors, right? So one of the things to think about here is in meetings is that often we get so frustrated and challenged. A lot of you, thank you, by the way, for doing the surveys in advance. You are frustrated by overtalkers, behaviors of overtalking in your meeting, and you're frustrated by people who are multitasking in your meeting. And I think the question is to ask why and get curious, pop those thought bubbles. Because for me, if I identify as an overtalker, if I have an audience, well, watch out, right? I'm going to share, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. I joked with my old team that I had a shirt that says, please facilitate me, right? It's just my dominant response. It's not good or bad. It's just my dominant response. Attribution error is something I want people to be very aware of. So in this situation, here's a person who's repeating herself over and over again. And the person in blue is like, ugh, this person loves to hear herself talk. So he is associating her behavior to her as a person and not acknowledging that she doesn't feel heard. That body language, that maybe the facilitator kind of put a shoulder. So she's repeating herself, like, I really don't think anyone heard me. Like I've been in a meeting before where I said something and nobody acknowledged that I said it. And my thought bubble was going gonzo, being like, did they hear me? Did they not hear me? Did I say something? Oh, what should I do? right? So that being cognizant of your role as a facilitator can drastically impact how people act in your meetings. And then there's evaluation apprehension. So this can be in a meeting that you're running where people are repeating themselves or going off tangent, and you know you're off track, you know you're not going to accomplish things, you don't want to be seen or pushy or bossy, and so you don't say anything. And I think often we don't stand up and create structure because we are afraid of how people are going to perceive us. So this is called evaluation apprehension. These are the thought bubbles that are happening, and they're happening at every level. They're happening as a student. They're happening as someone who's a CEO of an organization. No one doesn't have these thought bubbles going on. It is universal. And I think that's helpful to remember that we are all humans. And then you look to your left and your right, and we call this norming. If you don't, because we can't read people's brains, we look at body language. And if their body language doesn't look like they're frustrated, then we just kind of go with the flow. It's the same reason why you see those experiments where people, like a handful of people, face the elevator backwards and everyone else comes in and does the same thing because, like, I guess this is what we're supposed to be doing. But there's a good chance that they've checked out too. You know, people have been in, especially when you're trying to organize individuals who have been in your university for a long time. There's a lot of people said they're frustrated with sort of the ER behaviors, like this will never work. And the reality is they've probably been in a lot of meetings where it didn't go anywhere. So they don't have the trust that what you're trying to put forward is going to make a difference to begin with. And it's potentially a waste of their time. And so they check out. They're thinking about something else. And then the last term I wanted to share with you all is cognitive dissonance. And I really love cognitive dissonance. I love this term because I hope everyone embraces it. I find it's like your Jiminy Cricket, sort of like a Disney character that reminds you of when you're going sort of off your moral track. Because cognitive dissonance is when your behaviors don't match up with your values or your morals or your intentions. And you actually get a physiological response. Like I get like a little sweaty and uncomfortable, maybe a stomach ache. So in this case, there's someone who says, I'm a organized and reliable team member. And then they say, yellow, please give us your updates from the tasks in your last meeting. And they're like, oh, I didn't do my tasks. Again, this is another example where in the survey, people said they're really frustrated that they're not seeing progress in between their meetings. And often the reason why is because people are busy, but two, when they don't do their tasks, they're feeling awful. They're trying to rationalize for it. But a lot of times we let them off the hook as a meeting facilitator or as a team lead. We say that's okay, when really you're actually really frustrated. So this situation here, where people are saying one thing, they're thinking something else, this is where you get that feeling of artificial harmony on teams. This is where trust starts to erode. And this is where you start getting some hiccups in your ability to create change within your group or within your organization because you're not actually putting forth and running your organization on trust. So what is the role of a facilitator? What is your role? And this is something that all of you can do. All of you will have meetings going forward. Like there's big concepts that you're learning this week, but this is something that all of you have the opportunity to do. The role of a facilitator means that you need to be willing to change your behaviors and recognize people are bringing their ideas and their thoughts to the team, and you are there to allow them to be their best people place forward. And you are creating the space to allow for that emotional labor to take place so people can work well with others. So as a facilitator, it's all about you. You create the space for constructive discussions. You set and manage expectations. You're transparent with your process. You're clear about your role and responsibility. You model consistent, reliable behaviors. You are not alone. You work with others. This is not a solo sport. It is a team sport. And so whenever you feel like, this is all on me, you have to zoom back and say, no, it's actually something that we do together. I'm responsible for my behavior, and like it's all about me there. But really thinking through how you can be transparent with your process is going to be really important. Another way that I like to think about this is often when I'm in meetings, people just sort of talk about what is taking place. They're like, thank you for coming to my meeting. And it's sort of a single file line. People talk, but there's no structure, there's no process, there's no clear way to understand how you're going to hear from everyone for inclusive solutions. And no one is quite clear of what to do when there is that person who's oversharing or that person who hasn't spoken up the entire meeting, right? So if you want to actually hear from everyone, it's not just inviting them to your meeting, it's creating the structure, it's creating the process to ensure people actually get to participate. And going back to the football soccer analogy, people play a better game when they know that someone's going to call that the ball's gone out, right? Or when it's like a close call with like a technical, like it is helpful to know that. So as a facilitator, you sort of like suck up all of the awkward emotion that can come in a meeting, because people look to you to create that structure and process and make sure it's a fair meeting so everyone can bring their best contributions to the meeting. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through meeting mechanics now. So, because you're like, got it, right? There's this sort of the psychology of why it can be challenging just as an individual to think about behaviors. And then when it gets even more complex, when we talk about group dynamics, and then we also talked about sort of what is the role of a facilitator. And so now I'm going to give you some tools to think about in your next set of meetings to allow yourself to build trust with your team so you can accelerate change at a faster pace, and all of the important things that you'll be doing going forward. So I'll be talking about modes of engagement, meeting preparation, some tools, and then some follow-up as well. One of the things that I think is really important is that not all meetings are created equal. In some meetings, it's all about just giving information. This forum has been a really good example of that. There's been a lot of fantastic speakers that are like, here is information for you. There's also meetings when one person is seeking information, like they want to figure out what next steps are, and they could benefit from hearing some other perspectives, but at the end of the day, they are making that decision. And then there's the meetings that we usually call like the brainstorming meetings, where you're actually looking for a collective solution. So this is an example of, I'm kind of hungry, what should I have for lunch? And people are like, you should eat here. And you're like, I'm not in the mood for that, right? This is the example of like, what should we have for lunch? Because we're ordering from one place. So you actually do want to know if there's allergies. You do want to know if someone is vegetarian. You don't want to just like purchase something that no one else is going to eat. So that's the difference. The challenge is most people think that this is going on when this is going on, right? So it'd be really clear, again, transparency, because you're going to lose trust if you're not clear about your intentions behind a meeting. The other piece that I think gets missed, and I know has frustrated a lot of student groups that I've worked with, and even faculty and staff that I've worked with, is they come up with a fantastic plan collectively, like freeze frame, high five, but they forgot that there's a final decision maker who's not in the meeting. So being aware that you have, at the end of the day, a decision maker who needs to be engaged in this process is going to be really important. And thinking about the criteria, thinking about what they're going to be doing, bringing your passion forward, definitely. You don't want to filter everything out, but you also don't want something that goes nowhere, right? So thinking about options that might pass the test for the person at the end of the day who's going to fund it, who needs to sign off on that. This gets missed a lot. So I'm going to just like pause here for a bit. The other thing to consider is how you're preparing for your meeting. I've done a lot of these workshops. This is usually, by the way, a full day workshop with engagement stuff, but I'm just doing the summary of it. But most people say they spend like 15 to 30 minutes, maybe a little more, like 45 minutes to prepare for a 2-hour meeting. And I'm letting everyone know you should spend close to the length of the meeting, if not more, preparing for a meeting, which when you're super busy and there's a lot going on, it can feel like, no way, like that's going to be too much time. But if you think about the 12 people in your meeting who you're asking to sit down, especially in an industry like that I'm in where you bill your time, that's a lot of hours that if you actually don't meet your meeting goals, you wasted, I don't know, 20 hours if it's 10 people in the room, when you could have spent, an hour and a half, 2 hours preparing to have a constructive meeting. So I emphasize that you have to prepare for your meetings, because if you don't meet your meeting goals and it feels stuck, people are not going to trust your initiatives and they're not going to want to be a part of your programming. I can be a testament that I will test out organizations, and if they're disorganized in their meetings, I back out. I will be like, this is not where I want to spend my time. I need to trust that we're going to make momentum and go forward with that. I'll be curious if you feel similar. So what do you do in preparing for your meetings? Always have meeting goals. Always have meeting goals. And it is amazing how many meetings I go to that there isn't a goal. So I'll always ask, like, what's our goals for this meeting? So have clear meeting goals, state them at the start of your meetings and keep them visible throughout your meetings. In person, this is to me like written on a whiteboard or flip chart. In Zoom land that we all live in, it is a Google Doc that everyone can see and have access to and scroll up and see. So I think to myself, by the end of this meeting, what will I accomplish? Goals are different than agendas, just to remind you. Because after you have your goals, then you map out your agenda. You think to yourself, how am I going to support these goals? What is my process? Not just like, I'm going to talk to people. I want inclusive meetings. I want to hear from everyone. So when I'm setting my agenda, I'm not just thinking about how I'm going to meet my goals. I'm thinking about how am I going to hear from everybody. I'm thinking about how do I manage behaviors that are over talking. I think about how do I manage the behaviors that are under talkers. People have really good ideas, but kind of their dominant response is to be quiet in meetings. And I think to myself, what should happen before this meeting? I'm thinking to myself, what should I do after this meeting? Don't forget that this meeting is just one step in the direction of multiple. So people at the end of meetings are like, what's your next steps? And if you sit there and you're like, I'm not sure, you're going to lose some trust tokens there. You need to plan ahead because people want to know that you have structure and process in place to create change. People want that change. Also in your meeting prep, I think about the elements of my agenda. So each one of my agenda items, I'm going through, what's the task here? What am I going to ask people to do? Because if you're struggling with people multitasking, there's a very good chance that you're just talking at them. You're not asking them to engage with you. You're not giving them an activity. They're just checking out. And like everyone does that. I do that. And I think I'm like a A+ student when it comes to meetings. But if you can't engage with me, I'm going to check out because I got a shiny little cell phone that makes beeps at me. So you have to be more interesting than my cell phone. So what's the task? What's the outcome? What's my process? Here's how we're going to do it. And then I have a rationale. So I like to do breakout rooms a lot because I want to hear from everybody. And also breakout rooms help uplift the under talking behaviors and keep in check over talking behaviors and storytelling behaviors. So if I can create that space, then I have my rationale. And mostly over talkers are like, we don't need small groups. We're good here. And all the under talkers are not saying it, but their thought bubbles are like, oh, please let us do breakout rooms. I have something to say. And then I think about my expected time. And the reason why I think about my time is because I like to know that I am going to accomplish my goals. And sometimes when you have overambitious agendas, you're not going to get through everything. I don't share my time with people in meetings because they're going to immediately just wonder if I'm over or under time. And so I just let them participate. It's like a good host. You invite people, they eat good food, but they don't need to know that you're wrapped of ice. They don't need to know that. That's like not on them. That's on you as a host. And then, but you do have an internal agenda. You're thinking about how you're going to prepare for the meetings. You're thinking about how you're going to engage with them. You're thinking about the technology you need to use. You're making sure your internet's working, depending on where you are. You're thinking about how to engage people in this remote framework. And at the start of your meetings, you remind people what was accomplished in the previous meeting, because there's a good chance that they just jump from one Zoom meeting to another Zoom meeting and they don't even know why they're there. And if you're able to do that at the beginning, it can be really helpful. And I'm going to go through the next ones a little fast because I want to make sure we can get to the Q&A. But I think taking that time of a recap is always valuable, especially if you're having trouble with a continuity between your meetings. Yep, give space. The other piece is don't underestimate the power of setting core values for your group. I use this as a facilitation tool. I set core values. I repeat it often, especially when we're doing decision-making process and strategic plans. And I use it as a tool. If someone is sort of checked out, I'll say, oh, we have a core value of full participation. And if I feel like people aren't like popping their thought bubbles, I slow down and say, I need to make sure we have a shared responsibility of these outcomes. So I'm going to let people maybe pop their thought bubbles and get something off their chest if they need to. I mentioned the value of screen sharing because it allows a collective notes and allows people to make sure you're capturing what they're thinking and not, I find it can be really tricky when someone just take notes and then they send it to you later and you're like, who said this? It might have been your idea, but you didn't see them type it. And then it's tricky, like coming up with ideas is a lot of fun. Converging is not so much. Because we have loss averse as humans, right? It is really tricky. So I like to let people know the importance of acknowledging that converging and making action items and taking things off the table is going to be hard. And we call this the grown zone. So when you find that people are feeling frustrated and you're feeling frustrated, pause and say, we're in the grown zone. This is actually a good thing. This means we're making progress. It's going to be uncomfortable for a little bit, but I think we can get through there because you've thought through your decision-making process. So I'm going to talk about decision-making process really quick. And this PowerPoint will be available to you later, but don't rush the decision-making process. We often get stuck with these artificial timelines with our meetings, and therefore we push processes through that don't have full buy-in, and then we're frustrated that when it's time to actually do the work, people don't show up. So creating space for people to have divergent thoughts, creating space for it's like yes or no votes, I find to be too black and white when really we are on a gray scale. So I use this tool adopted by Keener, where it's called the scale of agreement, where I allow people to vote on a scale from I really agree to disagree, and then I have time discussions. And I find sometimes people are so frustrated that there's a person who put a 5 on, like they disagree, when the majority of the people were on when they're on the 5 and majority of people are on the green, because I just wanted to like move ahead. But then that person pointed out like a huge blind spot, and everyone's like, I am so glad you told us that, of course. I also want to remind people that if you are voting on something, it's easier to vote on a proposal with something that has context around it than just like one specific topic. So it's not like, I don't know, if we were choosing a theme song for the forum, right? You wouldn't just do the song. You would talk about why you chose the theme song, your rationale, and when it's going to be used. Like that gives a lot more context for people of when they're voting. So with that, I think I'll end with saying one of the last important things you can do is constantly ask for feedback. Ask how you can get better. If you're feeling like you're not making progress, if you feel like you're stuck, ask for feedback. You can say things like, what are my strengths? What are areas that I can be improved? Because you're never going to be able to know what your blind spots are. That's why they're called blind spots. And so you can lean on the people and build trust when you make adjustments to your meetings. And you're going to start creating that change from where you do your work. You don't have to look into the future to wonder when you're going to start creating that change. You can do it today. So with that, I just want to say thank you. It was a lot of fun presenting to you.
Thanks so much, Dallas. I feel like I learned a lot, and these are tips and tricks that will be applicable when students are working on these projects and probably into their professional careers. So thank you so much for this. We have a few questions popping up in the Q&A, and just a reminder to participants that you can feel free to add anything that you'd like to ask Dallas in that Q&A box, and we'll get to it. Dallas, it looks like right now some of the questions students are bringing up are related to different personalities and dominant responses in meetings. And before I get to those questions, I want to ask what your strategies are for identifying what your own personality is, so you know how to approach that meeting.
Oh, I think I get a little hesitant in saying personality, because personalities often feel like they're unchangeable or unmovable. And so I often look at people with behaviors and recognizing that. So I think for me, and I've encouraged everyone to do this, and this was actually something that Maya mentioned in one of her talks, is spending time to understanding why there's certain people who trigger you and frustrate you in ways that they do. The more that I've worked on myself, and this is through therapy, and this is through like books that I've read, and being cognizant of why I'm challenged by different types of behaviors, the more I've had compassion for the people who used to actually challenge me more. And so I being cognizant of your role and that you can't fake your way. The more of a leadership role you play, the more work you have to do because you're going to bring your baggage to the people you're trying to lead. And so that's, I think, a really important piece. And then the second part you were saying about is, Ashley, can you go remind me of the second piece of that? Just like the how to identify behaviors of
identifying what your dominant responses are so that you can best prepare for these types of meetings.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a big part is observing and not in the like reactive way, but in a sheer curiosity way. So if you're finding yourself challenged by people in your meeting, I think taking sort of like this a psychology anthropologist sort of framework and just making a note, being like, oh, that person speaks a lot in meetings, or this person isn't talking at all. That I just spend a little bit of time observing. When I'm working with clients, I ask them, I'll say, what is your dominant response? What are other people's dominant responses? What are you most challenged with? And then I think about my agendas. And when I'm supporting them in agenda development, I think about how to support that. But it's mostly observational and getting a sense of that.
Right. Great, thanks. And it seems like a lot of the students have done a bit of observing, both of themselves and of their teammates. We have a question here that has 9 upvotes. It's from Monica. What recommendations could you give us when the project groups are varied, but there are several people who have leadership personalities? How can we have a leadership that is fair and balanced in a way that everyone can make positive contributions?
Can you repeat that last bit? Your audio broke up just tiny. So if you could do that again.
Sure. The question is focusing on, having a group with many different leadership personalities. How can we, move forth as a team and allow everyone to make positive contributions?
Yeah, I mean, often that is like a huge asset when people have a lot of leadership personalities in your meeting. I think it is getting a shared vocabulary about what's happening and talking to people. One book that I would recommend, and I can put it into the LinkedIn group afterwards, is Difficult Conversations, I think by Douglas Stone. But one of the things that is interesting is we often, like people will say they get feedback all the time with people that they work with, but they don't give that type of feedback. They don't give a feedback that says, I think you're over dominant in meetings and I don't get to talk as much as I would like to. That's like off limits for a lot of people. So how do you learn to have those conversations? How do you learn to have a conversation with the 3 other people saying, ooh, I think we're clashing. I think our leadership style is clashing. I think it's getting in the way of us having impact. And I would like to have a real discussion about what we can do about it. Because if you can enter and have conversations from that space and not in like a shaming, judging way, but out of curiosity and a desire for a shared goal to work more efficiently and effectively as a team, then you really have an opportunity to problem solve. But if you don't talk about it because it feels uncomfortable, right? Because that social risk, usually people just suffer through teams that aren't gelling.
Right. And I think that ties into this next question that asks about a situation where a group is in the stage where everyone's just giving ideas and information. And the question is, I'm wishing that this group could suggest and participate fully and also take responsibility. How do I change the system from a 1 to many to 1 that makes everyone feel like a leader?
I think one thing to do to start is either volunteering or identifying who is facilitating meetings. And facilitating meetings does not mean you're a leader of the meeting. And I've worked with a lot of like board members that they're like, but I facilitate meetings. And I was like, you can still lead this organization and not be the facilitator. Like facilitators should actually have a more neutral stance and really their goal is to ensure that you hear from everyone and they're able more or less to be egoless in the discussion. That being said, not everyone has the option to hire an external facilitator. But in my old organization, I did a lot of internal facilitation. But I tasked myself. I said, I am the facilitator of this session, and therefore I'm going to strive to be a neutral facilitator, but I will let you know when I'm taking off my facilitator hat to have a strong opinion. And then with my team that I worked with, we rotated who was the facilitator. And there is an expectation of the facilitator to have planned for that meeting, to have thought whether it's a divergent thought process, lots of ideas, and also to plan whether they're coming together. And they had the goal and the responsibility to make sure they heard from everybody. Mm-hmm. That's when it becomes a team dynamic and not just a couple people calling the shots and everyone else just sort of like following what they're doing. Mm-hmm. I hope that answered that question.
Yes, definitely. And it's interesting that you've explained the role of the facilitator in making sure everyone feels heard. We have a question here that's focusing on the role of a meeting attendee and making sure that they themselves are heard. The question is, I personally have been in situations where I don't feel like I'm being heard. And after I thought about it, I realized maybe it was because my dominant response was to share my opinion and openly declare myself against others' opinions. How could I change this?
Ooh, nice self-awareness. That's a good starting point, right? Like, I honestly, when things aren't going well, my knee-jerk response would be like, it's them, right? Oh, they're the problem. But then my frontal lobe kicks in and I'm like, wait, what is that saying? If you're pointing one finger out, there's 4 fingers pointing back at you. I usually have to stop and think, what is my contribution here? Why might people not be addressing me? Am I hearing what they're saying first before I talk, or I'm just like waiting to say my opinion? And again, I think there is a really great, having a difficult conversations book. It does a really good job at talking about refraining, like having those conversations and saying, there's no right or wrong. It's just like, how am I contributing to these meetings? How am I potentially derailing them? And what role can I take? And once you've been honest with yourself, then you can bring that to maybe the leader of that meeting and saying, I recognize that I might be like a little negative or a one issue voter. I recognize that this might be my dominant behavior. And also I want to contribute. And I feel like I have a shared outcome here. And I would love to work with you on how we do that. Those are those really important like offline meetings that you can have in between sessions.
Mm-hmm. And I think that relates to another question that we have in here that's talking about your point of cognitive dissonance, which was really interesting to this participant and the type of thing that made them go, so true. And it asks, how can we overcome this cognitive dissonance in a meeting without being too harsh or coming off as a bad participant?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. We sort of lose track a little bit about being honest versus I think we relate with other people, and when we see someone feeling cognitive dissonance, like we want to help them reduce that feeling, right? And so we often let them off the hook. And I find, again, it's knowing your intent behind it. If your intent is to do some public shaming, you got to be really careful about that. It's the fastest way for people not to want to be around you or a part of your organization. But if your intent is to provide feedback to the person that them being late or them not following through is drastically impacting the impact your group can have, and you say it in a way with care and respect, then actually you're going to be able to help that person. And I think if you can switch it from thinking like, oh, this is going to be a shaming event, which, I mean, if that's your intent, you probably should double check yourself, to a like, how can I support this person in their career because they too want to make a difference in this world? Then it doesn't feel like a threat anymore. So certain things that I do, like people often can show up late to my meeting and they're like, I'm sorry for being late. And I don't say, oh, it's okay, because I don't think it's okay. I'll say, thank you for your apology. Just a simple thing. And they notice, like, she did not say it's okay. And I don't like this feeling. So they get to still hold on to that cognitive dissonance without me like piling down. The other piece about giving feedback is I like to give feedback the same way I would tell someone that they have food in their teeth. I don't do it in sort of this, like, imagine, there's a group of 10 people around and someone shows up and they're like, hey, Dallas. Now, I don't go, hey, everybody, check this out, food in their teeth. I pull them off discreetly to the side and they'll say, you have food in your teeth. And they're like usually really thankful that you told them, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone's a little embarrassed in the exchange. That's natural. But everyone's sort of thankful that you told them. And so I would think about your work as a leader and your work about holding people accountable really as gift giving and not threatening, and your intention and how you say that and being honest with, if you can share your thought process with them of why you're telling them.
Right. And, from what I can hear, you're speaking a lot about giving feedback on team dynamics and responsibilities and accountabilities. We have a question in the chat about giving feedback about ideas, and specifically around ideas that don't make the cut. So Maya has said, I appreciate how explicit you are that ideas have to be taken off the table in the convergence zone. When you take an idea off the table, the individual who proposed that idea may not feel heard because their input doesn't make it into the final product. How do you have a discussion about all input is valuable, but not all input can be integrated into our next steps?
That's such a good question, right? Because I know I want my idea to make the finish line, right? It was brilliant. No, I think the thing is this is where the meeting prep comes in. If you have not thought about how you're going to converge that list and you're sort of winging it and you're like, so this one's not going to make it, people are going to be like, what? Why? But if you say to them, this is my process for converging today. We have a set of criteria. We're going to do impact over effort. We're going to vote based on financial criteria, impact criteria, political timing of when and how we should do it, and then people interact with it. What happens is people naturally see ideas that are going to have the most impact. The ideas that make sense of timing rise to the top, and it's like a much more, again, another important reason to have visual management. And you can do this in Google Docs, you can do this with Jamboards, you can do this with all of these tools. It's a great way to collectively highlight what should be prioritized. And then that final decision making really is like 2 or 3 like really good ideas, and not like something out of left field that no one wanted to say no to. So it's the homework. You've created the process and the structure and transparency about how decisions are going to be made and how you're going to whittle down the list.
Right. And you've identified a few different tools that are really helpful when working in a group to make sure that structure actually plays out as planned. Can you recommend any other tools or techniques for making collective decisions in a meeting?
Yeah. I mean, there is like 101 books out there, I'm sure, that are about how you can do this. And so I think for me, I'm more interested in the theory behind how you make decision making, which is transparent, plan ahead, let people know how you're going to do it. Don't rush the decision-making process. Be cognizant of social norming, where people might want to like go towards the person in the room who might have more authority, right? So I think those are things you want to consider when you're thinking about how you're going to converge a list. And also not yes or no, allow for time discussions, things like that. Mm-hmm. That being said, I find the decision-making process, like I said, the impact over effort charts that are out there can be really valuable. I've also had people where people have a whole bunch of ideas on a sticky note, or this could be like a Jamboard sticky note. And then you have 2 buckets. You have like absolutely, like we have to do this, to maybe, to not right now. And people get to move stickers wherever they want to go. And then they leave them there. And if you disagree with where people put the stickers, you put it in a more discussion needed bucket, right? That way, you actually might have, at the end of the day, a bunch of things that moved into the more discussion needed bucket because people don't see eye to eye. But you also have a handful of ideas that everyone agreed upon. So even if you didn't like get a slam dunk that everyone agreed on things, you know that there's at least 3 or 4 things that people did agree on, which is a great tool that I learned and I've used quite often.
Right, right. I have an interesting question here about the makeup of teams and whether or not you recommend working groups that are made up of people who identify as different genders and different ages. And what kind of dynamics do you recommend to best deal with some of the societal structures that end up making their way into the meeting?
Oh, I mean, I think that you should definitely strive for having a whole bunch of variety in your meetings. I find that when I'm working with schools or people, they'll say, "Let's not invite this person. They're a little bit of a squeaky wheel." And I was like, "Let's bring them in right away to understand why, right?" And I think, I also hear like, "Oh, we'll have students off to the side and we'll check in." But I was like, "No, like let's bring not everybody. Not everyone can fit into a room. It's not a very productive meeting, but representation, especially of voices who often don't get heard, is important." And I'm learning a lot in the Jedi space myself, the justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, that just putting a call out doesn't necessarily mean you're bringing in all the voices that you need to hear. You need to actually be explicit in making sure that you have representation from people around you. And that might mean offering financial, um, like a stipend for those who like wouldn't be able to afford to go to your meeting because of they don't have the money to do that or the time to do that. So I think it's important to actively try to have a diverse group and then remind people with your core values that that's the benefit of this group, that the conflict, that tension that you feel isn't innately bad. It's actually it's more complicated. You might be in the groan zone longer than if it was just with a bunch of people who was already on the same page as you. But if you can bring everyone through, you're going to have a much better chance of actually succeeding in implementing that final idea or objective that you put forth.
Right. Thank you, Dallas. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I have a question about cognitive dissonance with regards to climate change and climate denial. Obviously, if you're working in an organization that isn't explicitly working on climate change and taking climate action, it can be very difficult to push forth the change that you want to see, especially because climate change and climate policy have become very politicized. What are your recommendations for addressing that?
I know it can be really tricky. I think the best approach is honestly, if you're in a space where people are in the climate denial. I mean, I have, you know, had conversations with people close to me where they're like, "I don't get it. Like, it doesn't seem like that big of an issue." And of course, part of me is like, I can't believe I'm having this conversation. But I'm like, this is actually helpful. This is really helpful for me to know why and get curious. And there's this term that I heard from my friend who's a marriage and family therapist about first order reality versus second order reality. So, first order reality, by definition, is something that you can measure, like scientifically. So, like a ruler. Like we can all agree that a ruler is, at least in the US, like 12 inches. And like if it was made of wood that's hard and rigid, and we could all measure this and scientifically prove that that's the case. But if I were to give that to my 4-year-old daughter, she would not be like, "Cool, let's go measure things." She'd be like, "Pirate sword," or like, I don't know, a number of different things. And if you're a bookworm, you might use it just to like as a bookmarker. And I think we can have arguments about, we can all agree what it's made of and the length of it, but we might disagree about the best use it is. And so I think this happens a lot with climate changes, where we talk a lot about the science and point to it again and again and again and again and again, and don't get curious about their second order reality and understand like why they feel that way. I had a friend in college, a roommate, who really liked consumerism in malls and stuff. And I was just like kind of disgusted by it because of just the nature of the waste that was associated. And then I got curious and I asked her a lot of questions. I found out that That was the only time she was able to spend quality time with her mom, was shopping. And I was like, oh, okay. Like it like made more sense to me. And I could meet her
Right.
where she was instead of this sort of like shaming space where I was entering. So I think when you're in that space, it takes a lot of personal work, a lot of like recognizing that sometimes you just need to hang out with people who have similar values and just like bathe in it, like this like forum here. Um, but also that isn't the bridge to reaching people where they're at. And I think getting curious, meeting them where they're at, and having like a long, meandering conversation in the direction of climate action is probably the best way to get there.
Right, right. And thinking about the audience that we have, we've got, students from around the world here who will likely start their careers as interns, as fellows. How can they go about creating change from the professional level they're at as participants in these meetings, in these processes, while respecting the leadership dynamics that have been put in place?
Oh, so true. I wish I brought my book up here. I have a book, and Melissa, I would love for you to find this link to add to the LinkedIn forum. It's called Everybody Poops. Everyone Poops. It's just like, my kids are potty training. I think it's just a reminder to ourselves that sometimes hierarchy is 90% in our head. Not that it doesn't exist in real life, but like I feel surprised as I started to grow in my organization and became the vice president at Greener U and now running my own organization, that people might look at me like unapproachable. And I was like, me? Like I look myself in the mirror. I'm like, this person? My goodness, no, please give me feedback. Like, let me know when I'm stepping in it. Like, I need to know these things. Like the last thing I want is for people to not tell me things because of this perceived hierarchy. So I think it's one, just check to see how much of that is just in yourself. And then two, hierarchy does exist, right? It exists by race and gender, especially depending on where you live. And there are organizations where people are very much like command and control.
Right.
And so I think it is just approaching it with candor and recognizing that if your intent is to improve the organization, you're being respectful. And if you're not going at it in a place of shaming and finger pointing, you're being respectful. If they choose to find it disrespectful, you can't really control that. And often in certain situations, you choose with walking power to be in an organization where your skill sets and your ambition will create change at a faster pace. That is sometimes a decision that people don't want to talk about, but it is always out there.
Right. Well, Dallas, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with all of us today. This has been incredibly helpful. We have probably about 25 seconds left. I want to invite you to give any closing remarks to the students around the world.
I am so inspired by seeing all of the people from all around the world, especially in this time of COVID when I haven't left my house in a long time, just to see the movers and shakers out there, and that be patient, be ambitious as hell, and also recognize to be patient. Sometimes I find we're so eager to do something that we're like treading water, trying to look for where we need to go. Like, should I go there? Should I go there? How am I going to create change in the world? And if the realization is if you just put your head down and started swimming, you'd be halfway there by now. So focus on what you can, focus on what's on in front of you. That's why I tried to whittle it down just to meetings today, because that is a place where I'm sure all of you can start creating change today. And I can't wait to hear how you do that.
Thanks so much, Dallas. It's been a pleasure having you here. Just a reminder to all the participants to add yourselves to the LinkedIn group, because all of the resources that Dallas has been speaking about and our other speakers have been adding have been posted in that group. So if you want to check those out, feel free. And all these sessions will be posted on our YouTube channel if you want to refer back to anything that Dallas brought up today. But thanks again for listening in, and enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thank you.